The Second World War ended in fire, rubble and silence, yet beneath the ruins of Berlin, Warsaw and countless occupied cities, a darker record was buried, sealed not by historians, but by intelligence agencies and men who swore oaths to erase the evidence of what truly happened. For decades, governments on every continent kept locked drawers filled with documents stamped Geheime Reichssache, top secret, and strictly confidential, each one holding details too volatile for the public eye. Whispers of vanished trains, disappearing U-boats, secret pacts, and phantom units flickered only in rumors, dismissed as conspiracy until fragments began to surface in declassified archives at the end of the Cold War. These were not myths crafted in smoky bars or fanciful tales for tabloids. They were files carefully redacted, names scrubbed, and testimonies buried beneath bureaucratic silence. To read them today is to touch history's hidden pulse, a reminder that wars are not only fought on battlefields, but in shadows, smoke-filled rooms, and underground vaults where truth is bartered like contraband. Each revelation carries the weight of betrayal, of hidden bargains and lives erased to preserve fragile alliances. As the paper trail re-emerges, scattered across Soviet, American, British, and German intelligence files, one fact becomes undeniable. The world was never meant to learn these truths. And yet, here they stand, surfacing from the depths of forgotten archives, demanding to be heard in full. 4 stories, once whispered, now echo like thunder across the silence of time. Chapter 1. The Vanished Train of Reich Gold. The final months of the Third Reich were defined by chaos, fear, and the frantic movements of men who understood that the empire they had pledged themselves to was dissolving faster than they could save it. In March of 1945, as the Soviet juggernaut closed in on Breslau, modern-day Wrocław, a file marked Geheime Reichssache, or Secret Reich Matter, crossed the desk of Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller. The document authorized the dispatch of a heavily guarded train, codenamed Sonderzug 77, from the city's central depot toward the Sudetes. It carried not civilians, not soldiers, but what Reichsbank officials described only as priority cargo. This train, sealed by order of the Reich Ministry of Finance and protected by SS guards under orders to shoot without hesitation, would become the center of one of the war's most enduring mysteries. Eyewitness testimony gathered after the war described at least 40 wagons, most of them covered, others modified with reinforced doors and additional locks. The manifest was not preserved, but scattered accounts from laborers forced to load the train suggest the cargo included gold bars taken from Reichsbank reserves, looted art wrapped in military tarpaulins, and sealed cases marked with strange sigils. Some crates bore diplomatic seals embossed with the eagle insignia of the Foreign Office. Others were heavier, lifted with cranes, their contents never disclosed. The operation's security was so stringent that Wehrmacht officers at Breslau Rail Command had no access to the train's final routing, receiving only a sealed envelope with instructions to forward it into the mountains near Wałbrzych. The men who watched it depart recalled a silence that clung to the air, a convoy vanishing into the night under a cloud of secrecy. The Owl Mountains, where the train was last sighted, were already under transformation by the Nazis, codenamed Reich Giant. The project was a vast subterranean complex of tunnels and chambers blasted deep into the rock under the oversight of Organisation Todt. Officially, these tunnels were meant to house underground weapons factories, safe from Allied bombing, but local villagers, Polish forced laborers, and prisoners from Gross Rosen concentration camp whispered that more sinister purposes were hidden beneath the drilling. The Reis network stretched for kilometers, its incomplete galleries marked by rusted machinery, abandoned dynamite, and collapsed ceilings. In this labyrinth, Sonderzug 77 was last reported. Gestapofileno. 17, unearthed decades later in the dusty shelves of Soviet archives, provides the last cryptic reference to the train. The file describes complete closure of tunnels after arrival of the priority transport, and notes the use of demolition charges to deny access. Soviet reports from 1946 confirm that NKVD mining battalions were sent into the Owl Mountains after their capture, tasked with opening sealed chambers. But official records list only limited finds: counterfeit British banknotes tied to Operation Bernhard, the Nazi plan to destabilize the pound sterling, and a small cache of paintings whose provenance was quickly erased. Notably absent were the Reichsbank gold reserves, the rumoured diplomatic archives, or any trace of the mysterious sealed crates. Survivors from Gross Rosen, interviewed by Allied interrogators, gave testimony that has haunted historians. They recalled trucks unloading crates lined with lead, carried into the tunnels under SS guard, some marked with radioactive warning symbols unknown to the labourers. The veracity of these claims remains debated, but the detail, multiple witnesses recalling the same stenciled insignia, cannot be dismissed entirely. One worker described the unbearable weight of a particular crate, lifted only with a crane, as SS men kept their rifles trained on those nearby. He later disappeared during the Soviet takeover, presumed executed for what he had seen. By the late 1940s, Western intelligence agencies began compiling their own fragments of the story. A 1948 CIA memorandum, redacted, but preserved in the National Archives, references unrecovered assets believed stored in subterranean Silesian sites. British intelligence files from the same period refer to high-value German state property, classified as missing. Polish post-war authorities attempted their own excavations, but political pressure from Moscow ensured their reports were buried. What emerged instead were rumours of ghost gold, the belief that Sonderzug 77 had never been recovered, but remained sealed in the mountains, untouched since 1945. Satellite imaging conducted decades later only fueled speculation. In 1976, Polish geologists identified anomalous voids beneath the Owl Mountains, rectangular shapes inconsistent with natural caves. Excavations were attempted in the 1980s, but halted after unexplained collapses and the deaths of workers in accidents officially attributed to poor safety standards. Some whispered of Soviet sabotage, ensuring the site would remain undisturbed. Others believed Western agencies quietly intervened, fearful of what might be uncovered. The diplomatic records rumoured to be aboard the train cast the darkest shadow of all. Historians suspect these archives may have contained evidence of secret wartime dealings between Nazi officials and neutral states, or even pre-surrender negotiations with both Soviet and Western representatives. If such files existed, they could have exposed covert channels of collaboration and compromise that governments on both sides of the Cold War were desperate to conceal. To reveal them would have fractured fragile post-war alliances and undermined the narrative of clear moral victory over Nazism. The question remains, if the NKVD truly found nothing but counterfeit notes, why did they continue to cordon off sections of the Owl Mountains until the 1950s? Why did Soviet military engineers dynamite certain tunnels closed rather than excavate them? And why do declassified CIA files from the 1950s reference assets recovered from Silesian sources with monetary values consistent with bullion shipments? The trail suggests that at least part of Sonderzug 77's cargo may have been quietly exhumed, its existence erased from public record and funneled into the hidden coffers of Cold War espionage. The vanished train of Reich gold is not just a story of looted treasure. It is a tale of secrets deliberately buried beneath rock and silence, of governments complicit in concealing truths too destabilizing to confront. It is a reminder that wars do not end with the signing of treaties. They echo into decades, their shadows stretching across new conflicts, their hidden cargo funding new struggles. Somewhere beneath the forests of Lower Silesia, the silence of the tunnels endures. Whether they hold only stone and darkness, or the sealed legacy of the Reich's final days, remains a question history has not yet answered. Chapter 2: Operation Iron Wolf in the Baltic. In the chaos of 1944, as the Eastern Front collapsed under the relentless advance of the Red Army, entire regions of the Baltic were transformed into contested territory, where loyalties shifted daily and survival often meant betrayal. Among the most elusive shadows of this period lies the story of Operation Iron Wolf, or Eisenwolf, a clandestine Waffen-SS detachment whose existence was denied by Berlin and erased by Moscow, yet whose footprint can still be traced in scattered testimonies and forgotten files. Unlike regular SS formations, Eisenwolf did not report through standard command channels. Instead, orders were conveyed through coded memoranda signed only with the Wolf Sangel symbol, a rune favoured by radical nationalist militias. These instructions often arrived in sealed pouches delivered by couriers who disappeared afterward, leaving no paper trail behind. The first credible reference to Eisenwolf comes from a fragmentary report dated October 12, 1944, filed by Colonel Ivan Serov of Smersh Counterintelligence. It described a group of black uniformed irregulars encountered near the forests of Kaunas, Lithuania. They had executed a withdrawing German supply column, including officers who had attempted to surrender to Soviet forces. Serov's account noted their equipment: captured Soviet submachine guns, German sidearms, and uniforms stripped of insignia, except for occasional armbands bearing a stylized wolf's head. The brutality of their methods shocked even hardened Soviet officers. Bodies displayed as warnings, documents burned, and orders left behind marked with runic symbols rather than signatures. Nazi archives remain curiously silent on Eisenwolf, as if the unit was meant to remain deniable. Yet scattered oral testimonies collected during Allied interrogations of SS officers after the war suggest a darker origin. Some claimed the detachment was drawn from fanatical elements of the Hitlerjugend and Baltic collaborators, trained in sabotage, assassination, and psychological warfare. Their objective was not to win battles, but to destabilize both enemy and friendly lines, ensuring that surrender would never come without blood. Others whispered that Himmler himself sanctioned their creation, using them as instruments of discipline against wavering Wehrmacht units, executing those who sought to capitulate prematurely. What makes Eisenwolf's presence particularly unsettling is the role it played in the Baltic resistance after Germany's formal collapse. Soviet archives declassified in the 1990s mention wolf units operating in Lithuania as late as 1946, conducting ambushes against NKVD patrols, sabotaging railway lines, and targeting local officials deemed collaborators. These reports, labeled bandit suppression operations, mirror accounts from villagers who remembered masked men appearing in the night, demanding food, ammunition, or silence. Survivors describe them as disciplined, silent, and relentless. Unlike ordinary partisans, unlike the Forest Brothers, Baltic nationalist insurgents who opposed Soviet occupation, these Iron Wolves answered to no nationalist agenda. Their war was one of revenge and survival, waged in shadows with no political manifesto. The brutality of their reprisals left deep scars. In Kaunas province, mass graves uncovered in 1947 revealed bodies of German deserters, Soviet soldiers, and civilians alike. Soviet investigators noted consistent execution methods: single shots to the back of the head, wrists bound with Wehrmacht issue cord. These details led Serov's Smersh officers to conclude that the same men responsible for executions in 1944 were still active years later. Yet Moscow suppressed these findings, preferring to label the killings as the work of bourgeois nationalist bandits, rather than acknowledge that remnants of the SS had eluded capture. Western intelligence agencies did not overlook these reports. Declassified CIA memoranda from the early 1950s contain references to Eisenwolf, elements of potential utility. Field officers in West Germany tracked whispers of former members resettled under false papers. Some recruited into anti-Soviet operations as the Cold War escalated. One document from 1953 describes an attempt to locate an Eisenwolf commander, known only by the codename Jaeger, believed to have fled through Czechoslovakia into Bavaria. The file ends abruptly, redacted beyond recognition, leaving only speculation about whether Jaeger was captured, killed, or quietly employed by Western services. For the people of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the legacy of Eisenwolf remains bitter. Oral histories collected decades later recount childhood memories of men with wolves on their armbands demanding silence. Some remembered them as protectors against Soviet terror. Others recalled them as butchers who executed neighbors accused of betrayal. What cannot be denied is their presence, etched into local memory even when erased from official history. The story of Operation Iron Wolf underscores the blurred lines of loyalty and survival in the dying days of the war. They were soldiers without a state, fighting both friend and foe, their existence denied by those who created them. Whether they were a last-ditch SS experiment, a rogue detachment, or a weaponized myth maintained by intelligence agencies, their presence shaped the violence of the Baltic long after the guns of 1945 fell silent. The wolves vanished into history's forests, but their howls still echo in archives, where black ink conceals truths too dangerous to acknowledge. Chapter 3: The Disappearing U-Boat Squadron. In the waning weeks of April 1945, as Berlin fell into flames and Hitler prepared for his final act in the Führerbunker, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed command of what remained of the crumbling Third Reich. Among his final orders was the deployment of Gruppe Seewolf, a small flotilla of U-boats sent across the Atlantic with instructions to harass American shipping near New York. This deployment is documented, and its boats were hunted relentlessly by the US Navy. But behind Seewolf's official mission, fragmentary records hint at a second flotilla, an unacknowledged group of submarines codenamed in Kriegsmarine cipher books as Phantom Line. Unlike Seewolf, these boats had no listed destinations, no standard call signs, and no surviving logbooks. They simply departed, slipped beneath the waves, and never returned to their ports. The first reference to Phantom Line appears in a decrypted Enigma intercept from Bletchley Park, dated April 28, 1945. The message referenced U-547, U-1239, and several others, using routing instructions that made little sense. One transmission noted rendezvous coordinates near the Canary Islands, far from operational theaters in the Atlantic. Signals ceased abruptly after May 2nd, and no wrecks, survivors, or captured crew ever surfaced. For decades, historians dismissed these boats as scuttled or destroyed in transit. Yet the absence of debris, reports of combat, or bodies washing ashore points to another explanation. They vanished by design. Interrogations of captured German naval officers shed unsettling light on their mission. In one report filed by US Naval Intelligence in June 1945, an Oberleutnant identified only as K spoke under duress of a sealed order, issued from Dönitz's headquarters at Plön. The document allegedly described cargo vital to the Reich's survival and forbade the opening of containers by anyone, short of the Führer himself. When pressed, the officer refused further details, remarking only that the cargo was not for war, but for what comes after. His words were stricken from official records, surviving only in partially redacted transcripts. What that cargo may have been remains the heart of the enigma. Some suggest bullion, the missing Reichsbank gold not accounted for in the ruins of Berlin. Others point to advanced weapons designs, jet technology, rocket components, even early nuclear research material. Argentine sources whisper of crates filled with sensitive documents and high-ranking fugitives spirited away across the Atlantic. Indeed, Argentine naval intelligence reported 2 unidentified submarines surfacing near Mar del Plata in July 1945. Weeks after the Reich's unconditional surrender, locals recalled uniformed men unloading heavy crates onto trucks that disappeared inland under armed escort. Official Argentine records later denied the event, but the rumors persist in coastal towns where older fishermen swear they saw wolf insignias on the conning towers. The US Navy dismissed these claims as rumor, yet declassified CIA memoranda from 1952 indicate ongoing surveillance of German expatriate colonies in Patagonia. These reports describe unusual wealth, unexplained supply chains, and communities speaking of cargo from the sea. No arrests were made, no confirmation secured, but the level of detail suggests that Washington feared more than simple myth. The Phantom Line may have delivered more than treasure. It may have delivered personnel whose expertise proved valuable. In the shifting allegiances of the Cold War, the disappearance of these submarines remains one of the most tightly controlled naval mysteries of the Second World War. Unlike U-boats sunk in action, no wreckage has ever been confirmed, no final positions charted. Wreck hunters scouring the Atlantic seabed into the 21st century have found no trace of U-547 or U-1239. The silence of the sea has preserved their secret. Was the Phantom Line scuttled in deep waters to prevent capture? Or did they reach their destinations, safe harbors in South America or remote coves guarded by silence? The implications are staggering. If the cargo indeed included gold, intelligence records, or advanced technology, then its disappearance reshaped the balance of power in the years that followed. If it included people, scientists, SS officers, or political elites, then the story merges with darker allegations of Nazi flight and Cold War collusion. Official history refuses to acknowledge Phantom Line at all, yet fragments of evidence compel us to consider it. The sea does not yield its secrets easily. Beneath the Atlantic swell, somewhere between Kiel and Patagonia, the fate of the disappearing squadron endures as a silent question. No victory parade, no formal surrender, only a convoy of steel leviathans slipping beneath the waves, carrying with them the Reich's final secrets into the abyss. Chapter 4: Stalin's Hidden Pact for Berlin. The endgame of the European war is remembered in sweeping images of triumph, Soviet banners raised over the Reichstag, American troops crossing the Elbe, Churchill and Truman celebrating a hard-won victory. Yet deep within Soviet archives declassified in fragments during the 1990s lies evidence of an arrangement never acknowledged in official history, a clandestine understanding known in Moscow by the codename Dymovoy Zaves, or smokescreen. According to internal NKVD memoranda, this arrangement secured Stalin's ultimate prize, the capture of Berlin, through a covert exchange with collapsing elements of the Nazi state. Far from a battle fought to its inevitable conclusion, the fall of Berlin may have been stage-managed through secret corridors of communication, a political transaction disguised as military inevitability. The origins of this pact can be traced to March 1945, when the Soviet First Belarusian Front under Marshal Zhukov pushed relentlessly toward the Oder. Intelligence summaries prepared by the NKVD indicated the Germans were considering partial surrenders to the Western Allies, particularly in Bavaria and Austria. These developments threatened Stalin's demand that the Red Army claim Berlin before Eisenhower's forces could breach the capital. On March 28th, a memorandum drafted under NKVD, Directive 412-45, records an unusual meeting in Potsdam between intermediaries of the Abwehr, already fractured and desperate, and Soviet agents posing as neutral envoys. The Germans proposed an arrangement. If certain Nazi officials were granted safe passage to the south, resistance in Berlin would stiffen just long enough for the Soviets to encircle the city first, ensuring Stalin's symbolic victory. Testimony from captured Abwehr officers supports this account. At the Nuremberg trials, interrogators recorded the words of a major identified only as H, who described orders to facilitate the movement of senior Nazi personnel toward Czechoslovakia under cover of rearguard battles. He claimed to have overheard the phrase Dymovoy Zaves, used in reference to Soviet channels, though the court dismissed his testimony as unreliable. Cross-referenced decades later with Soviet archives, his statement now appears less like delirium and more like a suppressed admission. The consequences of this hidden pact were catastrophic for Berlin's civilians. By delaying any prospect of organized surrender to the Western Allies, the city was condemned to endure one of the bloodiest urban battles in history. Between April 16th and May 2nd, 1945, artillery from Zhukov's and Konev's armies rained devastation, reducing entire districts to smoldering ruins. Women and children filled cellars, awaiting either starvation or the violence of advancing troops. If German forces had collapsed sooner, the city might have been spared weeks of carnage. Instead, Nazi units fought fanatically, perhaps driven less by loyalty to Hitler than by the hope of escape secured through the smokescreen bargain. Western intelligence documents from the same period suggest an unsettling awareness of these maneuvers. An OSS cable dated April 20th, 1945, notes uncharacteristic delays in Eisenhower's drive toward Berlin, despite the American capacity to advance. Some analysts later suggested that Washington willingly deferred, aware of Stalin's determination to claim the capital, but perhaps also wary of exposing the back-channel negotiations unfolding behind the front lines. By standing aside, the Allies preserved fragile unity against the Reich, but at the price of Berlin's destruction. The identities of those who benefited from the pact remain obscured. NKVD transfer logs list several convoys traveling from Berlin toward Austria in late April, their manifests classified. Among those rumored to have escaped were senior SS officials, industrial figures tied to wartime production, and even diplomats with knowledge of Nazi financial dealings abroad. Some surfaced months later in American custody. Others disappeared entirely, their fates erased by the fog of post-war realignments. The Soviet state denied these transfers existed, yet internal reports reveal an unusual concentration of special prisoners arriving in Moscow by June 1945, housed in secure NKVD facilities and never publicly tried. The narrative of victory has little room for such shadows. Soviet propaganda celebrated the storming of the Reichstag as a heroic finale, the culmination of years of sacrifice. Western accounts highlighted liberation and unity, yet buried within the silence are unanswered questions. Why did German resistance in Berlin persist to the point of civilian annihilation? Why did Soviet officers reference controlled surrender corridors in files never intended for foreign eyes? And why did both East and West maintain decades of secrecy around the final days of April 1945? Dymovoy Zaves was never signed, never ratified, and never admitted. It existed in whispers, in coded notes, in the discreet transfer of men whose identities were too valuable to expose. Its price was measured in rubble and blood, paid by those trapped within the city while their leaders bargained for survival. To confront this truth is to acknowledge that even in history's most celebrated victories, shadows stretch long, and the hands that raised the flag over Berlin may have done so through a bargain written in secrecy and silence. The shadows of the Second World War have never lifted completely. They linger in sealed vaults, in misfiled reports, in testimonies stricken from trial records, and in the half-truths whispered between intelligence officers who lived long enough to regret their silence. The vanished train of Reich gold, the wolves who hunted in the Baltic, the U-boats that never returned, and the Pact that delivered Berlin into fire all remain bound by one common thread: truths deliberately buried. These stories remind us that wars are not simply won or lost on battlefields, but negotiated in shadows where loyalty is traded, civilians pay the price, and archives are locked for generations. The unanswered questions are perhaps more disturbing than the fragments we can piece together. What treasure still lies sealed in the mountains? What men were allowed to vanish into the forests? What cargo reached distant shores? And what bargains shaped the destruction of a capital city? Each file we uncover closes no chapter but opens another, suggesting that the war's end was less a conclusion than a transition into the secret struggles of the Cold War. The silence of governments is telling. The gaps in official history are deliberate, and yet the truth surfaces, piece by piece, like wreckage rising from deep water. What else lies concealed, waiting for the right moment to resurface? And what will it cost us to finally confront the full measure of the world we were never meant to know?